The air in the lower decks always carried a taste of metal and old oil. It was a smell Jean knew well. Up above, the capital city of the Celestial Accord was a beautiful place of glowing white towers and floating gardens. But down here, in the machine rooms, it was all gray metal, buzzing lights, and the constant hum of engines that kept the beauty above alive. Jean moved through a narrow service corridor, his heavy boots making soft thuds on the grid floor. He was a human, a species still new to the galaxy. The rulers of the Empire, the Cthar, were tall and graceful, with sharp features and minds that could sometimes touch the thoughts of others. They lived for centuries. Humans like Jean were seen as short-lived and simple. Strong for labor, brave enough for soldiering, but not much more. He stopped in front of a large panel marked Primary Conduit 7. A small light on it was blinking red. A simple problem. He opened the panel, revealing a tangled mass of glowing wires and circuits. His hands, scarred and calloused, moved with a calm certainty. This was his job now. Fix what was broken. It was quiet work, and he preferred it. His mind often wandered back to his old life. He had been a soldier, a sergeant in the Auxiliary Corps. He had fought on a hot, dusty world at the edge of the Empire. He remembered the noise, the fear, and the faces of people he could not save. The memories were like ghosts, following him everywhere. A dull ache in his right leg reminded him of an old wound. He was a man held together by scars and silence. High above him, in a palace of crystal and light, Princess Myri was not enjoying the quiet. She stood in her mother's grand chamber, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The Empress Seohyun sat on a tall, elegant chair, her face calm and unreadable. She was a powerful ruler, and her every word was law. "The Ascendancy Gala is in 2 days, Myri," the Empress said, her voice smooth and cool. "You will be there. You will smile. You will represent our family." Myri took a small breath. She had her mother's intelligence, but not her coldness. She was a scholar. She spent her time studying history and cultures, even the cultures of the newer species like the humans. "Mother, must we?" Myri asked, trying to keep her voice respectful. "The gala? It's just a show of power. We parade our newest warships and strongest soldiers to remind everyone who is in charge. It feels cruel." A tall Cthar man stepped forward from the shadows. His name was Teho. He was a high-ranking noble, and many expected him to one day marry Myri. He was handsome, but his eyes were often proud and cold. "It is not cruelty, Princess," Teho said. "It is necessity. Stability comes from strength. The subject species need to see our power. It gives them order, especially the newer, more primitive ones. The human regiments, for example. Showing them as part of our military might gives them a purpose. It is an honor for them." Down below, Jean was rerouting a power flow. His tool accidentally tapped into a nearby comms line. He heard voices, clear and sharp, coming from a small speaker on his belt. It was the royal family's private channel. He should have switched it off, but the words made him pause. "An honor." Myri's voice came through, laced with frustration. "To be displayed as a tool? To be sent to die on worlds they've never seen? They are strong bodies and simple minds," Teho replied, his tone dismissive. "They are well suited for it. They are hardly more than intelligent beasts. Useful but replaceable." Jin's hands stopped moving for a moment. His knuckles were white as he gripped his tool. The words were like stones dropped into the quiet pool of his mind. He had heard this kind of talk before, from officers from other species. It never got easier. He took a slow, deep breath and forced his hands to start working again. This was why he preferred the machines. They did not insult you. They just broke, and you fixed them. He finished his work on the conduit and closed the panel. The red light turned a steady, peaceful green. His shift was over. He walked through the maze of corridors toward the human sector, a part of the station that was more functional than beautiful. The walls here were plain metal, the lights were brighter and less gentle. He entered his small room. It contained a bed, a small table, and a window that looked out not at the glittering city, but at the industrial docking arms and freight ships. He took off his heavy work jacket and sat on the edge of the bed. The ache in his leg was stronger now. He was only 35 years old, but he felt much older. He thought about the words from the comms line. Hardly more than intelligent beasts. He looked at his own reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw a tired face with tired eyes. He saw the scars. He did not feel like a beast. He felt like a man who was very, very tired. The next day, the station was busy with preparations for the gala. Streams of important Cthar and other alien diplomats arrived. Their beautiful clothes and quiet conversations filled the upper promenades. Jin's work orders changed. He was no longer fixing deep engine systems. He was assigned to check the public address systems and the environmental controls in the Grand Hall. It was work closer to the opulent heart of the station. He moved among the Cthar like a shadow. They did not see him, He was just another human worker, part of the scenery. He watched them. He saw how they moved, so graceful and sure. He saw how they looked at him and the other humans. A quick, uninterested glance. If they looked at all. He saw Princess Myri once, from a distance. She was walking with 2 guards, her face serious. She was looking at the decorations, a display of historic Cthar battles, with a frown. She did not look happy. Jean remembered her voice from the comms line, arguing against the gala. She was different from the others. But she was still one of them, a princess from a different world. His job was to ensure the air filters in the hall were working at peak efficiency. As he worked, he overheard 2 Cthar technicians talking. The Vrail delegation is smaller than expected. One said, "Good." The other replied, "They are troublemakers. I do not trust them." Jean stored the information away. The Vrail were a rival species, not part of the Accord. Their presence was always a tense affair. He finished his checks. Everything was working perfectly. He packed his tools and left the grand hall, returning to the familiar, grimy comfort of the lower decks. That night, he could not sleep. The ache in his leg was bad, and the memory of Teho's words echoed in his head. Useful, but replaceable. He thought about his friends who had died on that dusty border world. They had been brave. They had saved each other. They had been human. They were not replaceable. He got up and walked to his window, watching the freight ships come and go. They were bulky, ugly ships, but they carried the food, the materials, the everything that the beautiful city above needed to survive. The Cthar never thought about the lower decks. They never thought about the hands that kept their world from falling apart. He was just a man who fixed things. He was quiet, he did his job, and he tried to forget the past. He was a ghost in the machine, unseen and unheard. And he preferred it that way. It was safer. The grand events of the upper levels, the politics and the power, were not his concern. He was just trying to get through the day. He did not know that in just 48 hours, the fire would come, and the invisible man would be the only thing standing between the princess and oblivion. He did not know that his quiet, broken life was about to be torn open. All he knew was the dull ache in his leg and the deep, weary silence of his room. The air in the grand hall was thick with perfume and the low hum of polite conversation. Light from 1,000 crystal ornaments danced on the walls. Princess Myri stood beside her mother, a fixed, small smile on her face. She wore a gown of shimmering silver, but it felt as heavy as lead. All around her, the most important people in the Celestial Accord mingled and laughed. They talked about art, politics, and the impressive display of new warships that had been shown in a hologram earlier. Myri's eyes scanned the room. She saw Teho, looking proud and perfect in his formal military uniform, surrounded by admirers. She saw the Vrail delegation, a small group standing off to the side. Their posture was stiff, their expressions unreadable. A faint sense of unease prickled at the back of her neck. Something felt wrong. Deep below the glittering hall, Jean was finishing a last-minute repair. A coolant pipe near the main power relays had a minor leak. It was a simple job, but it kept him close to the noise and the crowd above. He could hear the muffled sound of music and applause through the ventilation shafts. He preferred the steady hiss of the leak and the solid feel of his wrench. He tightened the final bolt. His work was done. All he wanted was to go back to his quiet room up in the hall. The Empress Seohyun stepped onto a platform to give a speech. The room fell silent. She began to speak about the strength and unity of the Accord. Her voice was calm and powerful. At that moment, Jean was packing his tools. He heard a new sound, a sound that did not belong. It was a sharp, high-pitched whine, coming from the power relay behind him. It was the sound of a system being overloaded on purpose. His soldier's instincts, long buried, snapped awake in the grand hall. The main doors hissed shut and locked. A confused murmur went through the crowd. Then, the beautiful crystal ornaments in the ceiling exploded. Not with glass but with light. A blinding, painful flash of white light filled the room, followed by a deafening sonic pulse. People screamed and fell to their knees, clutching their ears and eyes. The Cthar, with their sensitive senses, were hit the hardest. Myri was thrown to the floor, her head ringing. The world was a blur of pain and noise. Through her blurred vision, she saw figures in black, armored suits pour into the room from hidden service panels. They were Vrail. They carried heavy, blocky rifles that glowed with a sickly green light. They moved with a cold, efficient purpose. They were not here to talk. Plasma bolts, sizzling in green, tore through the air. They hit Cthar guards, who were still stunned from the blast. The guards' elegant energy armor flickered and died under the Vrail weapons. The air began to smell of ozone and burned flesh. It was no longer a party. It was a massacre. Jean heard the explosion from below. He felt the station shudder. Alarms began to blare, a loud, screaming sound. He dropped his tool bag and ran. His path was not toward the escape pods. It was toward the source of the trouble. He did not think about it. It was an old habit, a duty he could not shake, that he used the narrow maintenance corridors, passages the Vrail would not know. He moved quickly and quietly. He could hear the sounds of battle growing louder, the zing of plasma fire, the screams, the crashing of furniture. He reached a small vent that looked out over a side chamber of the Grand Hall. What he saw was chaos. Kthar nobles were cut down as they tried to run. The Vrail were showing no mercy. Then he saw her, Princess Myri. She was crouched behind an overturned table, her silver gown a bright spot in the smoky room. 2 Vrail soldiers were advancing on her position. They kicked the table aside. Myri looked up, her face pale with fear and defiance. She raised a hand, a faint shimmer of psychic energy forming in the air around it. One of the Vrail fired his rifle. A green pulse shot out and the shimmering energy around her hand dissolved instantly. Their armor, he realized, could stop Kthar powers. They were helpless. The Vrail raised his rifle again, aiming at her head. Jean did not hesitate. He did not think about being a hero. He saw a person about to die. He slammed his shoulder against the vent cover, and it broke open with a loud crack. The 2 Vrail turned, surprised by the noise from below. Jean had no gun. He had his wrench and a plasma cutter used for melting metal. It was not a weapon of war. It was a tool. The Vrail were big, their armor thick. He was one man in a maintenance uniform. The first Vrail fired. Jean dove to the side, the plasma bolt scorching the wall where he had been. He rolled, came up close to the alien, and swung the heavy wrench hard at the soldier's arm. There was a crunch of metal and bone. The Vrail roared in pain and dropped his rifle. The second Vrail fired. Jean felt a searing heat across his back. The pain was instant and terrible. It was like being touched by a star. He cried out, stumbling forward. But he did not stop. The pain fueled him. He lunged at the second Vrail, ignoring the burning on his back. He jammed the plasma cutter into a gap in the soldier's armor at the neck and activated it. There was a sizzle and a choked gasp. The Vrail fell. The first one, clutching his broken arm, came at Jean with a knife. Jean was slower now, the pain in his back making his movements clumsy. He grabbed the alien's knife arm and they fell to the floor, struggling. Jean was stronger, but he was badly hurt. He managed to get on top and hit the Vrail in the head with his wrench, once, twice, until the alien stopped moving. He stood up, breathing heavily. The smell of his own burned flesh filled his nose. The pain on his back was a raging fire. He felt dizzy. He turned to look at the princess. Myri was staring at him, her eyes wide with shock. She saw a human man, hardly alive. His clothes were torn and smoking. Blood and soot covered his face. A terrible burn stretched across his back and shoulder. He was standing, but he was swaying on his feet. He had just killed 2 trained soldiers with a wrench and a tool. Their eyes met. For a second, there was only the sound of distant fighting and the blaring alarms. "With me?" Jean grunted, his voice rough with pain. "If you want to live." He did not wait for an answer. He reached out a bloody hand to her. Myri, her mind reeling, looked from his wounded face to his outstretched hand. This was not a noble guard. This was not a Kthar hero. This was the brute, the replaceable human. And he had just saved her life. She took his hand. The moment her hand touched his, a jolt went through Myri. His grip was strong, but his skin was cold and covered in a mix of sweat and blood. He did not look at her again. His eyes were already scanning the smoky room, looking for a way out. He was a man focused on a single task: survival. "Stay close," he grunted. His voice a low rasp. He pulled her toward the broken vent he had come from. The opening was small and dark. Jean pushed her gently but firmly toward it. "Down. Now." Myri hesitated for only a second, looking at the dark hole. Then she heard more plasma fire from the main hall. She gathered her long, silver gown and climbed into the vent, dropping down into the darkness below. Jean followed, his landing clumsy and pained. He sucked in a sharp breath as he hit the floor, the impact sending fresh agony through his burned back. They were in a narrow maintenance corridor. It was dimly lit by emergency lights and filled with the smell of grease and ozone. The blaring alarm was louder here, echoing off the metal walls. "Which way?" Myri asked, her voice trembling. Jean didn't answer with words. He just started moving, one hand pressed against the wall for support. He was walking, but it was a slow, heavy shuffle. Each step seemed to cost him dearly. Myri followed, her mind a whirlwind. She was a princess, a scholar. She was used to giving orders, to having plans explained to her. This man was silent, a wounded animal leading her deeper into the belly of the station. They heard shouts and the clang of boots on metal from a corridor ahead. Jean stopped, holding up a hand. He listened, his head tilted. He then turned and pushed open a heavy door marked atmospheric processing. They slipped inside just as a squad of Vrail ran past the intersection. The room was huge and filled with the roar of giant fans pulling air through filters. The wind tore at their clothes. Jean pointed to a narrow metal walkway that stretched over a deep, dark shaft. Across. He yelled over the noise. He went first, his body swaying with the wind and his own weakness. Myri watched him, her heart pounding. He was barely staying on his feet. Halfway across, a large piece of debris, shaken loose by the earlier explosions, fell from the ceiling above them. It was a large metal panel spinning down toward the walkway. Jean saw it. He didn't have the speed to push Myri. Instead, he turned and threw his body over hers, pinning her against the walkway's railing. The metal panel slammed into his back, right on top of his existing burn that he did not scream. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips. His whole body went rigid. For a terrifying moment, Myri thought he was dead. The panel clattered away into the darkness below. Jean slowly, painfully, pushed himself off her. His face was as white as paper. His breathing was shallow and ragged. "Keep moving," he whispered, the words almost lost in the wind. He continued across the walkway, each movement a clear and obvious torture. Myri followed, her own fear now mixed with a deep, growing horror. This man was being torn apart for her. They reached the other side and Jean collapsed against a control panel, slumping to the floor. We have to stop," Myri said, kneeling beside him. "You're bleeding." He shook his head, his eyes closed. "No time. They are sweeping the decks." He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. Myri looked at the terrible wound on his back. His uniform was burned and torn, and the skin underneath was a mess of black and red. The impact from the panel had made it worse. Blood was seeping through the fabric. She acted without thinking. She tore a long strip from the bottom of her expensive silver gown. The fabric was soft and strong. She pressed it against the worst part of the burn on his back. Jean flinched violently at her touch. "Don't," he growled. "Be still," she said, her voice firmer now. She was not a princess giving an order. She was a person trying to stop another person from bleeding. She wrapped the strip of silver cloth around his shoulder and torso, tying it as tightly as she dared. Her hands, usually used for holding data pads or delicate artifacts, were now stained with his red, human blood. It was a startling color, so much brighter and more vivid than the pale violet of Kthar blood that he let her do it. His head bowed. When she was finished, he used the control panel to pull himself to his feet. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the vent. His eyes were a deep brown, full of a pain that was more than just physical. "Thank you," he said quietly. The simple words surprised her. He was the one dying for her, and he was thanking her for a bandage. "What is your name?" she asked. "Jean," he said. "I am Myri." He gave a small, pained nod. He already knew. He pointed to a ladder that led down into a darker, hotter level. "The fire suppression for this sector is offline. The fires from the attack are spreading. It will be hot down there. It might be our only way through." He started down the ladder, his movements slow and careful. Myri followed him down. The heat hit them like a physical wall. They were in a sector where a plasma explosion had started a serious fire. Conduits on the ceiling glowed with orange light. Black smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Jean took off his scorched outer jacket and handed a torn piece of it to her. "Cover your mouth." He led the way, staying close to the walls where the heat was less intense. He was like a guide in a terrible landscape, a man who knew every pipe and corridor. He stopped at a junction where the way was blocked by a wall of fire. "There's a crawl space," he said, coughing, "beneath the main conduit. It's tight." He got down on his hands and knees, ignoring the pain it must have caused his back, and crawled into a small opening just big enough for a person. Myri, her beautiful gown now ruined and covered in grime, crawled in after him. The space was dark and filled with hot dust. They could feel the heat from the fire through the metal above them. They crawled for what felt like a long time. Jean was moving slower and slower. Finally, they emerged into a slightly cooler corridor on the other side of the fire. Jean collapsed onto his side, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He was at his limit. He was hardly alive. Myri crouched beside him. In the flickering emergency light, she saw the full extent of his suffering. He had borne her through fire and death, and he had asked for nothing. He was just a man named Jean, and he had given everything he had left to keep her safe. Jean lay on the cold metal floor, his eyes closed. Every breath was a small battle. The pain from his back was a constant, roaring fire that swallowed all other thoughts. He could feel the rough texture of the bandage Myri had made, the only thing between his ruined skin and the air. He just needed a minute. Just 1 minute to remember how to stand. A soft touch on his shoulder made him flinch. He opened his eyes. Myri was kneeling beside him, her face pale and smudged with soot in the dim light. She held a small, crushed water pouch she must have taken from a broken emergency kit on the wall. "Drink," she said, her voice quiet. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to tell her to save it for herself. But his throat was raw from smoke and thirst. With a shaking hand, he took the pouch and squeezed a little water into his mouth. It was warm and tasted of plastic, but it was the best thing he had ever tasted. He handed it back to her. "You too." She took a small sip, her eyes never leaving his face. "Where do we go now?" Jean pushed himself up onto his elbows, a wave of dizziness washing over him. He forced it down. He looked around, getting his bearings. They were in a long corridor used for cargo storage. It was deserted. The air was still hot, but the immediate danger of the fire was behind them. "The emergency shuttle bay," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "Deck Gamma. It's not the main one. The Vrail will have that blocked. This one is smaller. For maintenance crews. Can you walk?" she asked. He nodded. A lie that was obvious to both of them. Using the wall for support, he slowly, painfully, got to his feet. His legs felt like water. He took a step, then another. It was a slow, shuffling walk. Myri moved beside him, not offering to help him walk, but staying close, ready if he fell. They moved through the silent corridors. The only sounds were the distant, fading alarms, the hum of the station, and the sound of Jin's labored breathing. He was a ghost leading a princess through the corpse of the station. He would stop sometimes, leaning against the wall, listening. His soldiers' ears were still sharp. He heard the distant shouts of rail search parties and would change their route, leading them down a different, darker path. Myri watched him. She saw how his eyes scanned every corner, every vent. She saw the way his body was broken, but his will was like iron. This was not the brute she had heard about in court. This was a person of immense strength and quiet focus. He was not hardly alive. He was more alive than anyone she had ever known, because every moment he was fighting for it. After a long, slow walk, they reached a heavy door marked Gamma Bay, authorized personnel only. Jean entered a code on the panel beside it. Nothing happened. "Power's cut," he mumbled. He looked at the door's manual release. It was a large wheel. He gripped it with both hands and tried to turn it. His muscles strained. A sharp cry of pain escaped his lips as the movement tore at the wound on his back. The wheel didn't move. "Let me help," Myri said. Together, they put their hands on the cold metal wheel. "On 3, Jean said. 1, 2, 3. They pushed with all their strength. Jin's face was tight with agony, but he did not let go. Myri pushed, her slender arms shaking. With a loud, rusty screech, the wheel began to turn. They spun it until they heard a heavy clunk from inside the door mechanism. Jean pushed the door open. The shuttle bay was small and dark. Only one craft was there, a boxy, utilitarian transport shuttle used for moving parts and workers. It was not beautiful, but it looked solid. Hope, for the first time, felt real. They were almost there. Then a voice cut through the silence, cold and sharp. A human rat and a lost princess. What a prize. A Vrail soldier stepped out from behind the shuttle. He was bigger than the others, his armor marked with rank. He aimed his plasma rifle directly at them. He had been waiting. Jean moved instantly. He shoved Myri hard, sending her stumbling behind a stack of cargo crates. The movement was too much for his body. He fell to his knees as a green plasma bolt sizzled past where his head had been. The Vrail laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Look at you. You can barely stand. Give me the girl and I will make your death quick." Jean stayed on his knees, his head down. He looked defeated, broken. The Vrail took a step closer, confident. "A fitting end for a beast," the Vrail said. That was when Jean looked up. His eyes were not the eyes of a defeated man. They were cold and clear. As the Vrail took another step, Jin's hand shot out to a panel on the floor. It was a power coupling port. He ripped the cover off, revealing live, sparking terminals. The Vrail was too close to stop. Jean grabbed the soldier's armored boot and yanked with the very last of his strength. The Vrail stumbled forward, his leg crashing down onto the open power port. There was a loud crackle and a flash of blue-white light. The Vrail soldier screamed, his body convulsing as a massive electrical surge shot through his armor. The smell of burned circuits and flesh filled the air. After a few seconds, he collapsed to the floor, smoke rising from his suit. He did not move again. The effort cost Jean everything. He fell onto his side, his body spent. He could not get up. He could not even roll over. The world was growing dark at the edges. Myri ran from behind the crates. She saw the dead Vrail and then she saw Jean, lying motionless on the floor. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch him and cause more pain. "Jean," she said, her voice desperate. His eyes fluttered open. They were having trouble focusing. "The shuttle," he whispered. Code 72 Alpha. He was telling her how to get in. He knew he couldn't do it himself. Myri looked from his broken body to the shuttle. She knew what she had to do. She stood up, her heart pounding. She ran to the shuttle door and entered the code he had given her. The door hissed open. The inside was dark. She found the manual for the emergency start sequence. Her hands shook as she followed the instructions, pressing buttons and flipping switches. Lights flickered on inside the shuttle. A low hum started as the engines came to life. She ran back to Jean. He was trying to crawl, his arms dragging his lifeless legs. He was not going to make it. Myri, a princess of the Celestial Accord, did something she had never done in her life. She bent down, hooked her arms under his shoulders and started to pull. He was heavy, so heavy. She gritted her teeth and pulled with all her might, dragging him across the bay floor toward the open shuttle door. It was a slow, agonizing journey. Every inch was a victory. Finally, she managed to get him up the short ramp and into the shuttle. She collapsed beside him, her breath coming in gasps. She crawled to the pilot's seat, her mind racing. She had studied basic shuttle operations, but she had never flown one. She pressed the commands for launch. The bay doors ahead of them began to slowly grind open, revealing the blackness of space, dotted with stars. An alarm blared on the console. Proximity alert. A Vrail fighter, drawn by the power surge from the shuttle startup, was moving to block the bay door. Myri's hands froze. They were trapped. From the floor behind her, Jean spoke, his voice barely audible. The manual override. The big red lever. Push it forward and hold it. She saw it. A large, red lever covered by a safety guard. She smashed the guard with her fist and slammed the lever forward. The shuttle's engines roared with a power they were not designed for. It was an emergency burn, a dangerous and reckless move. The shuttle shot forward like a bullet, scraping through the narrowing bay door and missing the Vrail fighter by inches. They were free. They were in space. Myri set a course for the nearest Accord fleet signal and then fell back into the chair, trembling. She turned to look at Jean. He had lost consciousness. He lay on the cold metal floor of the shuttle, pale and still. He had borne her through fire and given her the stars. And now he was hardly alive. The first thing Jean felt was pain. It was a deep, constant ache that covered his entire back and shoulder. Then he felt the softness of a bed beneath him. He was not on the cold floor of the shuttle. He was alive. He opened his eyes slowly. The light was soft. He was in a clean, white room, a medical bay. Tubes ran from his arm to a machine that beeped quietly. He tried to move, and a sharp bolt of pain made him gasp. A medbot hovered closer, its single blue light scanning him. "Please remain still," a calm, electronic voice said. "You have sustained severe plasma burns and physical trauma. You are receiving treatment." Jean lay back, his mind fuzzy. Memories came back in pieces. The fire, the fight, the princess, the escape. Myri, was she safe? He looked around the room. He was alone. Of course he was alone. He was a human maintenance worker. They had fixed him up and would soon send him back to his duties. That was how it worked. The door to his room slid open with a quiet hiss. Jean expected a doctor or maybe a military officer to debrief him. It was Princess Myri. But she was not the scared, soot-covered girl from the station. She was clean, and she wore a formal, high-collared dress of deep blue. Her hair was arranged perfectly. She looked every bit the daughter of the Empress. Behind her, Jean could see the crowded hallway was filled with people. Important Kthar in elegant robes, Imperial guards in shining armor, and Teho, his face like a storm cloud. Jin's body went tense. This was it. He was to be thanked, perhaps given a small reward, and then dismissed. He prepared himself for the formal, empty words. He looked at Myri, waiting for her to speak. She did not speak. Instead, she walked calmly to the side of his bed. Her eyes met his, and he saw no pity there, only a deep, unwavering respect. Then, to his utter and complete shock, she did something he could never have imagined. Princess Myri knelt. She lowered herself gracefully onto the floor, her head bowed slightly, her hands resting on her knees. It was the traditional Kthar gesture of supreme gratitude, of deep respect. It was an act performed for heroes and elders. It was never, ever done for a human. A dead silence filled the room. The people in the hallway stared, their mouths open in disbelief. Teho took a step forward, his face twisted in anger. "Myri, get up. This is an obscenity." Myri did not move. She stayed on her knees, her gaze still fixed on Jean. Jean could only stare back, his mind blank. He was just a man, a broken soldier who fixed pipes. This was not right. This was too much. He tried to find words, to tell her to rise, but no sound came out. Then Empress Seohyun entered the room. Her presence was like a cold wind. She looked at her daughter kneeling on the floor before the wounded human. Her face, usually a mask of calm control, showed a flicker of shock, and then a slow, dawning calculation. She saw the faces in the hallway. She knew this moment was being recorded, broadcast across the empire. Myri, the Empress said, her voice cutting through the silence. Explain this. Myri lifted her head. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying through the quiet room. You call them brutes, she said, looking not at her mother, but at the crowd of nobles. You call them replaceable. You see them as hardly alive. She turned her gaze back to Jean, lying wounded in the bed. But this man, whom you see as nothing, has more honor and courage than anyone in this room. She paused, letting her words sink in. He did not save a princess. He saved a person. He did not do it for reward or for glory. He did it because it was the right thing to do. He bore me through fire when he could barely walk. He fought my enemies with a tool in his hand. He gave everything he had left to get me to safety. She looked directly at her mother, her eyes blazing with a new kind of strength. He asks for nothing, but I owe him everything, and so I kneel, not to a human but to a hero, and I ask you, all of you, to look at him, really look at him, and ask yourselves what it truly means to be alive, to be strong, to be worthy of respect. The room was utterly still. The only sound was the soft beeping of Jin's medical monitor. Jean looked at the princess kneeling at his feet. He saw the stained strip of silver fabric from her gown, now tucked into a belt on a medic's tray, the bandage she had made for him. He saw the determination on her face. He saw the shocked and angry faces of the Kthar nobles. He understood then that her kneeling was not an act of submission. It was a challenge. It was the first shot in a different kind of war. Empress Seohyun looked from her daughter to Jean. The calculation in her eyes was complete. The image was powerful. The story was undeniable. The brute was a hero. The princess was his defender. It was a story that could change everything. Rise, my daughter, the Empress said, her voice neutral, giving nothing away. Myri stood, her posture straight and proud. She did not look away from Jean. Taeho stepped further into the room, his disgust plain. This is a disgrace. A human is not worthy of such an honor. He is a tool, a thing. Jean had been silent until now. The words, so familiar, so bitter, finally broke his silence. He was tired of being a thing. He looked directly at Taeho and then at the Empress. His voice was rough from disuse, but it was clear. I am a man, Jean said. 3 simple words. But in that room, after what everyone had just witnessed, they were more powerful than any shout. He was not a brute. He was not a tool. He was a man. The Empress's eyes narrowed slightly. She looked at Jean, truly seeing him for the first time. She saw the scars, the pain, and the unbroken will in his eyes. She saw a symbol, a dangerous one. Indeed, the Empress said softly. The word hung in the air, full of meaning. The moment was over, but nothing would ever be the same. Myri had knelt. Jean had spoken, and the foundation of the celestial accord had just cracked. The silence in the medical room was heavy and deep. It was broken by the sharp sound of Taeho's voice. This is an insult to our entire people, he said, pointing a finger at Jean. He is a human. He should be rewarded with credits and sent back to the lower decks where he belongs. Empress Seohyun did not look at Taeho. Her eyes were fixed on her daughter, and then on the man in the bed. The image was burned into her mind. Her daughter kneeling, the human looking down at her, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding. It was a story that was already spreading across the empire. You could not stop a story like that. The insult, the Empress said, her voice cold and clear, was the attack on our home. The bravery was the action that saved my heir. She turned her head slowly to look at Taeho. Do you question my judgment on what constitutes an act of heroism? Taeho's mouth closed. He took a step back, his face pale. He had overstepped. The Empress looked back at Jean. You are a man of surprising resilience, Jean. The celestial accord does not forget its debts. Her words were careful. They were not a warm thank you. They were a political statement. She then turned and left the room, her guards following. The crowd of nobles in the hallway began to disperse, their whispers filling the air. Taeho shot one last, hateful look at Jean and Myri before he too left. The room was quiet again. Myri stood by Jin's bed. She looked tired, but her eyes were calm. You should not have done that, Jean said quietly. They will hate you for it. They already disliked my ideas, Myri replied with a small shrug. Now they must respect my actions. And his. She looked at him. How are you feeling? The medbot says I will live, Jean said. It was not really an answer. Over the next few days, Jean healed. The medbots repaired the worst of the damage to his back, though a network of pink, new scars remained. He was moved to a better room, one with a window that looked out at the stars. He was given good food. but he was still a prisoner of his situation. Everyone knew who he was. The story of the kneeling princess and the human soldier was the biggest news in the empire. Myri visited him every day. At first, their conversations were awkward. She was a princess. He was a soldier and an engineer. What did they have to talk about? But soon, they found common ground. She asked him about his homeworld, about Earth. He told her about oceans and mountains, things she had only read about. He asked her about Kthar history, about their art. She explained the meaning behind the gestures, the colors, the stories. He learned that she was smart and kind, and that she truly believed in a better empire. She learned that he was thoughtful and quiet, and that his strength came from a deep well of caring for others. They were from different worlds, but in that quiet room, they became friends. 1 week after the attack, Jean was cleared to leave the medical wing. A guard came to his room and told him the Empress required his presence. He was given clean, simple clothes, not a maintenance uniform, but not noble robes either. He followed the guard through the palace. He walked with a straight back, but he still felt the ghost of the pain with every step. They arrived at the doors to the Grand Hall, the same hall where the attack had started. The doors were repaired. The guards opened them. The hall was full of people. Every important Kthar was there. The room was silent as Jean walked in. He saw Empress Seohyun on her platform. He saw Taeho standing to the side, his expression cold. And he saw Myri, standing near her mother, a small, encouraging smile on her face. Jean walked to the center of the room and stopped. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He simply stood, a human man in a room of aliens who thought they were better than him. Empress Seohyun spoke, her voice amplified through the hall. Jean of Earth, you have performed a service to the throne that cannot be repaid with simple credits or a promotion. You saved the life of the future Empress. In the sight of all gathered here, I acknowledge this debt. She paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with her nobles. The old ways are comfortable. They are easy. It is easy to see those who are different as less. But strength is not just in elegant forms or long lives. Strength is in the heart. It is in the will to stand against fire for another. You have shown us a new kind of strength. She gestured to Myri. My daughter, through her own action, has shown us a new kind of respect. It is a respect that must be earned, not given by birth. The Empress looked directly at Jean. Therefore, I create a new title. You will be the first royal sentinel. You are a protector of the throne, a living symbol of the bond between the Kthar and humanity. Your voice will be heard in matters concerning the well-being of all species in the accord. A soft murmur went through the crowd. It was an unheard of honor. It gave a human a direct line to the Empress. Jean was stunned. He had expected to be sent away. He had not expected this. He looked at Myri. She gave him a small nod. He turned back to the Empress. Your Majesty, he said, his voice firm. I am an engineer. I fix things that are broken. I will accept this title, if my first duty can be to help fix the broken ideas about my people. A true, small smile touched the Empress's lips. It was the answer she had hoped for. It shall be so. The ceremony ended. The nobles began to leave, talking excitedly. The world had changed. Taeho left without a word, his future suddenly uncertain. Jean and Myri stood together in the now empty hall. Royal Sentinel, Myri said. It suits you. It is a big responsibility, Jean said. He looked around the beautiful, repaired hall. He remembered the fire and the fear. There is still much to do. Yes, Myri agreed. But now we will do it together. Jean was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was a man seen and heard. He was no longer just a body hardly alive. He was a symbol of a future where strength came in many forms, and where a simple act of courage could make an empire kneel, not in defeat, but in respect. The journey was over, but a new one was just beginning.